Hey, what's up? It's Jake from Nimbus DevOps, and now I'm going to go over scopes and name resolution. So we talked about scoping and namespaces already once before, but now we're going to kind of expand on that concept a little bit because it was a little early in the conversation, so we're going to take a little bit of time and get into this. Um, so in the terms of functions, right, which is what we're kind of going into right now, I'm going to start with a really simple example. So I'm going to define my function, and I'm just going to say test equals 1, and this is going to be defined in the local scope of this function. Okay, so I have a variable test is equal to 1, and then I'm just going to print um, my underscore function and then comma test, and we should get 1 back. Okay. Um, so I have a function, I defined it. Okay, I didn't do anything with it, but I defined it, and I'm just going to say test equals 0 here. But and this has a different scope. So this is defined in the global scope because it's outside of the function. And then I'm going to call my function, and we're going to print global test. Okay. So we define the test name in two different places. It's actually in two different scopes. We have a local scope and a global scope here. The global scope is set to 0 here. The local scope is set to 1. When we execute the code, let's see what happens. So let me make sure I'm in the right directory. So we want to be in Python scripts. And I'm going to make this a little taller for you. And I'm just going to execute this by typing Python scope.py. My function 1 global 0. So as you can see, I was able to call this function and return a different value of test. So it's pretty clear test equals 1, test equals 2, or test equals 0. I think you probably get that. So in the global context, test is still 0, right? You can see from the output. But we find the test again in the function body, we set point to an integer value of 1, and you can see it has different value. So both the two test names exist, they're just in different scopes, so they're pointing to different integer objects with two different values. So if we comment out the line test equals 1 here, I just comment this out, okay, then what happens? Well, we can see that because of the way that the code is executed, it's going to go through the function and print this and see that it's not defined and use the global scope and therefore print out both 0. So just remember it does it searches the test in the local and it doesn't find anything, and then it goes to enclosing and it doesn't find anything, and then it goes to global and it sees it finds something, and the last one is built in. So LEGB, that's your order that we talked about. So let's try something a little different. So let's say that let's see, we're going to keep test 0, and let's do an inner. There we go. Okay, so in here what I'm going to do is I'm going to define an outer function. I'm just going to call it outer, and I'm going to say test equals 1, and this is going to be my outer scope. Okay, and then inside of this I'm going to define a function called inner, and inner is going to say test equals 2. Okay, so this is my inner scope, and then I'm actually going to, as part of this inner function, I'm going to print inner, and then we'll just print the test value. Okay, so I'm saying test is 2, and I'm going to print this inner scope, and then I'm going to define outer here, and it's going to define test as 1, but also define a function inside of outer called inner. Hopefully that's not too horribly confusing. So we define inner, so I'm actually going to call inner here, and then I'm going to print outer, and then we're going to print out test there. And I'm going to call my outer function here. So what do you think is going to happen? If you take a look at this closely, we can see that we have an outer function that just defines test as 1, calls this inner function, and prints outer. And then inner function also defines test with a different integer 2 and prints 2. So we should see inner 2, outer 1, and then test is 0, and so it should say global 0. So let's run this and see what happens. Inner 2, outer 1, global 0. So now you got to be careful, because as you can see, you can have a variable with 3 different variables with 3 different values using 3 different scopes and get 3 different results in your output. So if you try commenting something out, like test 1, for example, and you run it again, we can see that inner is still 2, but since outer does not have a defined value, it's not going to go into the inner function define 2, because this variable test is local to the outer function. So that's as far down as it can go. It doesn't have an enclosing scope, so it's going to default to the global here, and test is not defined as a built-in function or values, so we have to define it as global. So that's pretty much it for that. Python does give you the ability to define a function in another function. As you saw with the inner function's name is in the namespace of the outer function. And so whether you can call these functions and variables whatever you want, but it's just important to remember that scoping matters, and you may not get the value you're looking for depending on the scope you're using. And you may need to do this where you're using the same variable name and just need to remember that the scope is completely different. So the last thing I'm going to do in this video is talk about global and non-local statements. So we can alter what happens in the shadowing of the test name and use a special statement called global or non-local. So in this example, we defined, let me uncomment this, test to be 2 inside this inner scope, right? So when we do this, we overwrite test, or we don't overwrite tests in this outer scope or in the global scope, right? But we can get read access to these names if we need them in a nested scope, because it doesn't define them. You can actually modify them, because when we write an assignment instruction, we're defining a new name in the current scope. So let me show you how we do this. So what we can do is I can change this to a non-local, and instead of an inner doing this, what I can say is I can say non-local test. Okay, so now what does that do? Well, we still have our outer scope here, but what I'll do is I'll change this comment. What's actually happening is you're getting the nearest enclosing scope, which in this case is outer. Okay, so we're saying test is 2, but this is a non-local value, so you need to grab it from somewhere else. So in this case, it will be 1. And everything else remains the same. So the body of the inner function has the test name declared to be non-local. which I know sounds weird, but there are cases where you'd want to use this. So, as you can see here, inner is 2, outer is 2, and global is 0. Interesting. So this means that declaring test to be non-local in the inner function, we actually get to bind the test name to one declared in the outer function. So if you remove this, like that, then the inner function basically does the same thing, but you can see here you get different values. I hope that makes sense. So that's your non-local. There is a way to get test 0 in the global namespace. You just have to use the global statement. So if I use global test, so inside of here, if you're trying to figure out how to get this inside of a function, so you're kind of going backwards, instead of going local and closing global built in, you're using the local variable and trying to pull in, right, or read the global value. You would just set this to global, and you can see that inner is 2, outer is 1, and global is 2. So we're saying we want to define this here locally, but this is also going to be defined globally. Okay. So hopefully that makes sense. If you have any questions, let me know, and we'll move on to input parameters.